Hey class, this is Mr. Clark, and these are the video lecture notes for the essential standard entitled The Influence of the U.S. Constitution on World Political System, Standard 10.1.3. Next slide. Here's the bubble map. You've probably seen that before. The first heading on this bubble map is federalism. The United States Constitution is the world's oldest and has influenced political systems throughout the world. So our Constitution was actually the first modern Constitution, and many other countries have patterned their constitutions on ours. Next slide. Our Constitution places limits on our government. Next slide. It's like a rule book about how the government must act. So the purpose of the Constitution is to give rules to government so that the government doesn't just run wild. Next slide. One characteristic of the Constitution is known as federalism. The definition of federalism is it is the concept that the national and state governments share power. It's one way that power is limited. It's called federalism. Next slide. In the U.S. Constitution, powers are shared between the national and the 50 state governments. So in the United States, there's national or federal law, and each state also has its own set of laws. For example, it is a national law that men at 18 have to register for the draft, for example. That is a law in all 50 states, not just in one. Whereas each state has its own particular laws. For example, in Nevada, casino gambling is legal in some states, whereas in most of the other 50 states, it's not. So it's a way that power is divided. It's called federalism. Power divided between the national and the state governments. Next slide. Many countries around the world practice federalism, including South Africa. In South Africa, power is shared between the national government and the 9 provinces. Their states are called provinces. They have 9 of them. The United States has 50 of them. And these two aren't the only countries around the world. Mexico, for example, practices federalism. So do many other countries. Next slide. And here's a Venn diagram that shows the powers that the national government has here. For example, the power to declare war is a national power. The states have the power to establish schools, for example, and they both have the power to do certain things like raise taxes, borrow money, build roads, and so forth. Next slide. The next characteristic of the Constitution that I want to talk about is another way that power is limited, and it's called separation of powers. This is different than federalism, but it's somewhat similar. It says separation of powers is a concept of government which divides government roles between different branches. And this diagram shows those branches. The president, representing the executive branch, has certain powers. The courts, representing the judicial branch, has certain powers. And Congress, representing the legislative branch, has certain powers. Each one of these branches has its own powers and in many ways limits the other 2 branches. Next slide. Oops. Go back here. Sorry about that. The purpose of this system is to ensure that no branch holds all the power. Again, the president does not have all the power, neither do the courts, neither does the Congress. They all have their own specific powers, and they share power. Next slide. I used the example in class of paper, rock, and scissors. In paper, rock, and scissors, each of the hand positions here has its own power, but in a way, each limits the other hand positions. So it's There's three, kind of like our three branches of government. So that's the example that I like to use. Next slide. In the US Constitution, there are three branches of government. We just talked about that. Next slide. Another example that I used when we were talking about this before is imagine our government's like preparing a meal. The legislative branch writes the menu, which are like laws. The executive branch cooks the meal, like carrying out the laws. And the judicial branch samples the meal and tastes it and makes sure it tastes good, just like the courts make sure the laws are fair. And that is another way of looking at our constitutional system and the system of separation of powers. Next slide. Many countries in the world today have separation of powers. One of those countries is South Korea, and it also, like the United States, has three branches of government. But South Korea is not the only one. Many countries have copied and emulated the United States. Next slide. A third characteristic of our Constitution is a concept known as popular sovereignty. This is a big fancy word. I always try to look for the middle part of this word, the part that says reign, which refers to power. So popular sovereignty means power basically from the people. The government gets its authority from the people and reflects their will under this system, not from some king or from God or somewhere else, but the people. Next slide. The first three words of our Constitution, we the people, are an example or a demonstration, I guess you could say, that our Constitution is based on the idea that power does come from the people. Next slide. Our Constitution is not the only world constitution that references popular sovereignty. The Japanese Constitution begins with the words, "We, the Japanese people." Many world constitutions begin with basically that same phrase. And again, in a way, they're emulating or copying or using our Constitution as a model, because that's how our Constitution was written. And since ours was the first, many countries have used that same phraseology, I guess you could say. Next slide. And the last characteristic of the Constitution is that I'm going to talk about today is the concept of individual rights. In our system, liberties, privileges are guaranteed to each citizen, and they're not these rights, according to the way we look at rights, so the way our founding fathers did. These rights were known as unalienable rights. That is, they were rights that came basically from not from government anyway. Many of them believed they came from God, but they certainly weren't rights that the government bestowed on people. They were rights that existed with or without the government. Next slide. In the US Constitution, the Bill of Rights guarantees certain basic freedoms that the government cannot take away, including freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, the right to assemble, the right to keep and bear arms, the right not to have your home searched without a proper warrant, the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney. There's all these rights that exist independent of government and that government cannot take away. Next slide. In today's world, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights says that, quote, "all human beings are born free and equal," end quote. Next slide. So the United States Constitution was the first modern constitution and has been a model for other nations' constitutions. And it's got these characteristics. Again, these characteristics are federalism, the idea that power is shared by the national and state governments. You've got separation of powers, which is a further division of power within the national and state government. That's where each one of those is divided into branches. You've got popular sovereignty, the idea that government power doesn't come from a king and it doesn't come from God or anywhere else. It comes from the people. And then finally, the idea that human beings have rights that governments cannot take away. Anyway, thank you. I hope you do well.